course, it's a really crazy story to hear. I'm sure many of our viewers have heard what's happening. Multiple Americans have been detained in Turks and Caicos for allegedly traveling with ammunition in their bags, which they have said was mistakenly. You traveled with a bipartisan and bicameral group to Turks and Caicos recently. Can you talk about that experience for us?
Yeah, so just recently I went with this a congressional delegation. We went into Turks and Caicos. We met with the State Department officials there on the islands, U.S. State Department. We met with the detainees. We met with some of their family members. We also met with business leaders of Turks and Caicos, for example, those involved with the resorts like Beaches and Sandals and the hotels as well. And then we also had a meeting with the government officials on Turks and Caicos. And all of this was to try to see if we could get these Americans released with just paying a fine and not having any jail time.
So let's break down those conversations, if you would, for us. How are the conversations with the detainees? Because one of them is your constituent.
Yes, I have a constituent, Brian Hagrick, and he's actually going to be sentenced tomorrow. He had 20 rounds, 20 rounds of ammunition mistakenly left in a checked bag. And when he was departing the island, that's when Turks and Caicos discovered it. Now, normally when this happens, it's handled as a Border and Customs Act violation that the tourist pays a fine and is released to their country of origin. Here, though, Brian was taken into custody. The State Department waited 2 whole months before they contacted him even. And now he's facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 years in a prison that the UN has flagged for humanitarian rights violations. So this is totally unacceptable. There's 3 other Americans that are currently detained, and they had even smaller amounts of ammunition, all left accidentally in either duffel bags or a purse. For example, with a grandmother from Florida who had two rounds of 9mm ammunition that she was discovered with. So this is completely unacceptable, and it's out of step with how other countries treat individuals that accidentally bring ammunition into a country.
You're calling on the State Department to issue a do not travel to Turks and Caicos. You also met, as you said, with business leaders of the island. I'm sure they wouldn't want this. Talk about those conversations.
So you would think the business leaders on Turks and Caicos wouldn't want to do not travel, and you'd also think they'd be sympathetic to the Americans that are detained. I was shocked because one of our most hostile meetings was with the business community. There was a lot of victim shaming, a lot of victim blaming of these Americans. They made inflammatory comments against Americans and American tourists. They were truly adversarial toward us. I was shocked because when you look at it, the Turks and Caicos economy is almost totally dependent on American tourism. Tourism is roughly 70% of their economy. Americans are roughly 86% of all the tourists coming into Turks and Caicos. We're so prevalent on the island that the Turks use U.S. dollars as their form of currency. Also, imports. 90% of imports going into Turks and Caicos comes from the United States. So we are in a position that we can have a lot of leverage here. I don't think the business leaders were willing to admit that. But certainly the anti-American sentiment I picked up on was very palpable. And I think that's driving a lot of this.
In those meetings, I mean, that is surprising to hear. Was it more of you sitting there and listening? Did you respond? What did your contributions look like?
I really sat back and I listened because I wanted to get a realistic, I wanted them to talk because I wanted to hear what they had to say. Now, I did engage with the government officials. I engaged heavily with our own State Department members. But as far as the business community, I really wanted to hear their side of the story. And at the end of the day, there's no negotiating with the business community. The business community, it's up to them to go to the Turks and Caicos officials, tell them they want these Americans released, and explain to them that their businesses will go under if it's not for American tourism. And what they need to realize is that it takes one order from the Biden State Department. They could do what's called a do not travel order, which would prevent any cruise ship, for example, from leaving a U.S. port and going to Turks and Caicos. That would destroy the economy of Turks and Caicos almost overnight. Additionally, if you're flying into Turks and Caicos going on vacation there, you can't get traveler's insurance, you can't get vacation insurance. So Americans will just choose to go elsewhere. U.S. Virgin Islands, for example, Puerto Rico, but they won't go to Turks and Caicos if we have this do not travel in place.